to the Seeds of Justice, a webcast series that will focus on various environmental law topics ranging from energy and climate change, waste, oceans, and environmental justice. Nature's rights are as important as humans' rights. This is the beginning of a seed to sprout in your hearts and regenerate the compassion to act together to save our planet as well as humanity. Emotions have been the trigger of most major changes in the world, but it was always rational and decisive action that have made the changes happen. So, the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, together with the Asian Development Bank, produced a platform that will strengthen the capacity for environment and climate change laws in Asia and the Pacific under the Environmental Law Champions Program. I will be your host, Natalia Manes, a student scholar of Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law and a law student and an environmental advocate. Today, we will be enlightened by an inspiring story of of the objective and goals of Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. Matthew Baird has over 30 years of experience in environmental and planning law in Australia and in Asia. Since being called to the New South Wales Bar in 1991, Matthew has been at the forefront of environmental litigation, including climate change and environmental crime in Australia. From 2014 until 2021, he acted as an advisor on environmental law with the Myanmar Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation. He was an advisor and member of the Permanent Secretariat of the Technical Working Group for Cambodian Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment from 2015 to 2018. During 2020 to 2021, until the coup in Myanmar, he was acted as an advisor to the Ministry of Planning, Finance, and Industry on ESG issues for major project developments in Myanmar. Matthew has been based in Southeast Asia for the past 12 years. During the time, he has conducted professional development workshops, training materials, and training sessions with a number of organizations and for judges, lawyers, civil society groups, investigators, and prosecutors. He has provided training for judges in Cambodia, Thailand, Bhutan, the Pacific, Myanmar, and for environmental law academics and practitioners in most countries of Southeast Asia. The director of Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, let us all welcome Matthew Baird.
Thank you very
Hello,
much, Natalia.
Matthew.
Thank you so much.
How are you?
I'm very, very well. It's great to be here. Thank you for that very, very nice introduction.
Yeah, actually, first of all, I would like to acknowledge you and the team for creating a platform that will inspire others and for continuously serving the people with compassion for the environment and laws. You've been serving for almost 30 years in protecting the environment and sharing your knowledge about our environmental laws. So, when did you realize that you are going to be an environmental lawyer and be involved in environmental justice?
It was a while ago, a long time ago. I still remember coming to my father and my parents at the time and saying I really wanted to be a lawyer, and people saying, "Oh, that's good. What type of lawyer?" And I said, "Well, I want to be an environmental lawyer." And they looked at me and thought, "Well, that's okay. You'll have a very good life. It may not be financially rewarding." But here I am, 35 years later, having a wonderful opportunity to launch this Seeds of Justice webinar. But for me, it was when I was growing up. I grew up in a place called Hunters Hill in Sydney, and it was one of the sites, or it was the site of one of the world's first modern green bands, where the organised labour, the unions under the Builders Labourers Federation, came together with the housewives of Hunters Hill, as they call them, including my mother and a number of her friends, to work in 1968 and 69 to protect what was one of the last remnant bushlands in Sydney. And it was a really important place because it was a place where there was a lot of evidence of Indigenous Australian history and culture. It was a very small area of land on the harbour of Sydney foreshore. And it was going to be bulldozed and developed into 32 apartments and 32 units. And so the local community came together and approached the union movement. And the union movement said, look, if you can demonstrate that your community is committed to supporting and protecting the environment, we will come out on strike, and our workers won't go and bulldoze the area. And so the community came together and showed how Kelly's Bush was such a really important part of that local community. It's where we played growing up. And so the union movement came together and they called for what they called is a green ban. So they said they wouldn't destroy it because of its cultural heritage and because of its natural heritage. And the person who led that, a guy called Jack Mundy and his deputy, Jim Owens, then proceeded to take that philosophy throughout Sydney in the 60s and 70s. And they actually made sure that the colonial and Indigenous heritage of Sydney was protected from development. And so what that means is anytime you go to Sydney and you're in the Rocks or Paddington or Hunters Hill, you will see all this amazing heritage, both built heritage and cultural heritage, but also the natural environment. And it's all been protected because the local unions came together with local communities to stop the forces of development. So I think there was no sort of way I could be anything other than an environmental lawyer. And that's what I am now, and very, very happy to be so.
Yeah, that was amazing. And I believe you're 6 years old at that time? Six or
Yes, yeah.
12 years old? Yeah. And I feel like you are really meant to be a guardian of Mother Earth because when you are just young, you are open to that environment already. So
And I think it was that idea of just, knowing that this was this was a place that was my home where I grew up. And so seeing that other people had fought for that, I thought
yeah.
that's what I had to do.
Yeah, that was great. So can you explain to our viewers why environmental law matters and how do you think can law change the earth?
So the simple answer to the second question is yes. I mean, I've been a lawyer now. I graduated in 1990, and I started law studies in 1985. So that's a long time ago. But for me, law has always been something that is a tool that can be used. It means that in some ways it's conservative, but you can still use it. You can still reach out, and it provides that body of knowledge and that structure. That means that if you've got some good arguments and you can use the law well, and you can work with others to create that momentum, that's how it can achieve great results. And we've seen that in so many countries. We've seen it in the Philippines with some amazing cases by some amazing attorneys there. But for me, when I was at the end of school, we had a case where in Tasmania, the Tasmanian government wanted to build a hydro dam, and some amazing people like Bob Brown and Christine Milne and Jerry Bates and others, and thousands of ordinary members in Tasmania and around Australia stood up against this Gordon Below Franklin Dam, which then led to one of the first big court cases in Australia over environmental law and the power of the Commonwealth. The Labor government had been re-elected on the promise that they would stop this hydropower dam in the wilderness of Tasmania, and they passed laws to protect the World Heritage Conservation Area. The lawyers for the Wilderness Society and other activist groups argued that this law was constitutionally valid. The government of Tasmania and the Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission argued that it was unconstitutional. And the High Court, in a very important Tasmanian Dams case held that the Commonwealth of Australia had the power to protect World Heritage, and so the law was valid, and that meant that the rivers and that amazing wilderness was saved. And when I was admitted to the bar, it was 153 CLR, the Commonwealth Law Reports, volume 153, that contained the Tasmanian Dams case, and that was the one that I brought to court when I swore my oath as a lawyer. So for me, that's where good laws are really important. Good advocates are very important, and that public interest side of things is so important. But working with communities, whether they're Indigenous communities or activists, NGOs, you can really bring together a good coalition to enforce the law. But if the law is not good, then we have to get ready to change it. That's also another important thing.
Yeah, actually, I remember the one of our lesson with Attorney Ipat. She told as well that case that you have to be connected with other people. You cannot just pass the law or just create a law. You have to connect with other people in order for it to be implemented correctly. Because most of the time, the indigenous people knows more about the nature. So we really have to, yeah.
And that's where I absolutely, I think, for me, environmental law has always been about building connections with people. And one of the other things, the transformative things that happened to me after I left university, I worked with a judge, Justice Paul Steen of the Land and Environment Court, an amazing man, an amazing judge, and I'm still very good friends with him and his wife Barbara and family. But he was a true, visionary environmental lawyer, and as a judge, made some amazing judgments, including one that corporations were liable to criminal penalties, and they couldn't argue that they had the privilege of self-incrimination as individuals did. He said, no, these are companies, and they didn't have this privilege of self-incrimination that was only available for humans. And that was very transformative in the way that we did environmental crime against corporations 30 years ago. But after I finished with him, I then went and I had a job up in Cape York Peninsula. And Cape York Peninsula is the pointy bit in Australia. It's about the size of France and Belgium. It's probably larger than the Philippines in terms of total area. And there are 14,000 people who live there, 6,000 white and 8,000 Indigenous communities, and there are about 20 different Indigenous communities. And I went to work with the Cape York Land Council, and this was a time of great change. We just had the Mabo decision, which finally recognised that Australian territory, the Australian continent, was actually owned by Indigenous Australians before the colonial invaders came in 1788. There was this doctrine of terra nullius, that Australia was this vacant country and therefore the British could claim it all. And the High Court in 1993 finally determined that was a fiction and a lie, and indeed Indigenous peoples owned and had sovereignty over Australia, which is why they then led to the native title legislation that was passed. But it was the first time that the court recognised that Indigenous ownership and custodianship of the land was there in 1788 and survived. Not in all cases, but certainly over vast areas of Australia. And so I went up to Cape York, and that's majority Indigenous owned, and the Indigenous communities, and I started to talk with them for a big land use planning strategy. And for me, as a white boy growing up in a very white suburb in Australia in the 1980s, this was transformative, meeting people who could trace connections of their land back generations and hundreds of generations. And as they say, bicentennial, 200 generations, 40,000 years, they had this connection with the land. And for me, that was just such a powerful experience to then understand how that traditional knowledge and traditional culture could intersect with Western law and Western construct. And it had to do that because the Western law wasn't going to go away, the colonial and the invasion and the immigrants weren't going to go away. And so we had to develop a compact. It's still a challenge in Australia, and I think Australia hasn't succeeded very well in reconciling with its Indigenous community. A work in progress, as we say.
Yeah, actually, that's when we realize that we are all connected, really, with nature. And with that, since you've been active on dealing with several issues about the environment, what is the role that a network of think tank can play to meet the new challenges confronting the environmental law?
Thanks, Nalia. And so, one of the things that for us, when we established the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law about 5 years ago, is I always thought it was going to be a little small organization. We'd have a few seminars, we'd do a few events and conferences. But that really changed about 18 months ago, and in some respects it changed for COVID. I had met Paulo Boro and I'd met Rocky Guzman at different events, and we were able to come together. And as Rocky had, in the middle of his master's program, had to come back from China to the Philippines, we decided, look, we should do something. And over the last 16 months, we've then organized, I think, about 16 webinars, 2 major conferences, one on ASEAN environmental law and one with the Asian Law Student Association of the Philippines. We've now got, a network of about 3,000 to 5,000 people who are connected on environmental law issues. And I think we were just very surprised that there was such a real passion for environmental law and a commitment, which shows how important just bringing networks together. We've also been able to partner with organizations such as the Asian Development Bank and their Environmental Law Champions Program, United Nations Environment Program, and Georgina Lloyd, who replaced Andy Rain in Bangkok, 2 amazing Australian environmental lawyers who have been so supportive of us. But we've also met with great academics from all over the region and students who have really got behind and got involved and excited. So that's brought together that network that's enabled us to keep doing different webinars on soils or animals, air pollution, oceans. And so that's been just so exciting to see those networks. And I'm trying to bring in also the Australian environmental law groups who face different problems from that which we do in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, but recognizing that there's a lot of things that we can share and a lot of experiences even in Southeast Asia that we can share to Australia and New Zealand and other countries as well. So the network is, I think, one of the exciting things about networking is you never know where it's going to end up. And that, in some respects, is the most exciting thing about this Asian Research Institute, that we've been able to connect with so many different people.
Yeah, actually, that was we just have to join them to the, or guide them to go to the river, but it's up to them if they're gonna just stare at the river or just gonna swim in the river. So just do what we do. And one of the one of the webinars I attended from Ariel, Attorney Oposa said that he observed that most of the passionate lawyers are the environmental lawyers. And I love that. And aside from networking and attending or participating in conferences or meetings, what other advice would you give to young aspiring lawyers like me who want to integrate environmental law in their career?
So I think the exciting thing these days is we can use technology, and for students in particular, connecting through internet, Zoom, StreamYard, all these things that I still think are quite magical in some respects, that we can use them to really create that network. When I was at law school, with some good friends, we established the Sydney University Environmental Law Society, and we would organise famous people like Peter Garrett, who was the band member in Midnight Oil, who became Australia's Environment Minister. And we'd sell recycled paper, which back in 1989 was a big thing. Now students sue corporations, take human rights actions. wander the streets, hopefully not getting arrested. They can change, they can become agents of change. And I remember when I was listening to Greta Thunberg say, what have you done? And I felt a little bit embarrassed, but I thought, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I should be okay. But I still felt, oh, maybe I could do more. And that's where, for me, I had great mentors and advisors and supporters when I was at university that allowed me to come to conferences and be involved. And I would always be Matthew Baird asking a question. I once asked the chief judge of the Land and Environment Court, I was still a student, if I could, in my final year, practice and bring a case before him. He almost fell off the platform because it was not done in Australia for students to take court cases. But now we can, students through clinics or through works, we can work on changing laws, changing regulations in local governments, or working on bigger picture issues, and we can connect. And I think that's the exciting thing is, don't wait for someone to tell you what you can do. Decide what you want to do and then do it, and find an organization or a group who will help you achieve those goals. For me, that, looking back, I was very, very lucky. I met these amazing lawyers. I remember going to some early conferences in 1991 in the United States. They had this organization called eLaw, which is where I also met attorney Ipat Luna back in 1990, the early 1990s. And the John Bonine and Mike Axline set up the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, which back in 1991 had 10 members, and now has hundreds around the world, and it's a global network of public interest lawyers. But I met people like Lananath Da Silva and Kamena Gunaratne from Sri Lanka, who were fighting amazing environmental law battles. I met people like Ipat, Mazatmat Sentosa in Indonesia. And then recently I met people like Tonio Poza, Golly Ramos, Jerti, Rosalisa, amazing environmental lawyers who have done things that I would only dream about in my career. And in Thailand too, I've met some great environmental lawyers, and I've worked with some amazing people in Cambodia. All throughout the region, there are some amazing people, amazing lawyers doing amazing work, and that's part of what we want to do, is bring these Asian stories to that international sphere, because the lessons we learn here can be very important, because the issues are so real. The challenges to run a court case, are much more difficult than anyone in Australia or Europe or America can really imagine. And so bringing those issues out, is very important.
Yeah, actually, I love that you mentioned. I love your advice that you have to find a mentor or an organization. And I am fortunate. I will not be here without Ariel. And of course, my mentors. I have my Ninang, of course. I have Attorney Ipat. I'm really, really fortunate. I always say to my journal, I'm always writing every morning, and I always said that I cannot do this alone. Without my mentors, I am not here. I will not be here talking to you, the director of Ariel. Yeah, I'm just so fortunate about it. And
And
this is
and
a, yeah.
I don't, I just was going to say, I don't think any of us do things alone. Environmental lawyers, we network. I remember, we used to always say when we could meet, at the end of the event, the Filipino lawyers would get out the guitars and start singing. We'd all try and join in. They were the best. And so we network, and we get together, and we exchange stories, and we share those things and those experiences. So yeah, and we don't know where it's going to end. That to me is the exciting thing. 12 years ago, when I first came to Asia, took a sabbatical to was writing a book about the future of Australia, which was still a problem back then, and it's a worse problem now. And then a friend asked me, would I come to a conference? And I said, well, I'm a little bit busy, but it's in Chiang Mai. I'll go. And from there, I was then asked to help some lawyers in Cambodia with Vishnu Law Group on an environmental impact assessment law, and they were helping the government of Myanmar. government of Cambodia, and then from there I then helped on this environmental code for the Kingdom of Cambodia. And from that, then I was asked to come by Earthrights International. And in 2014, I ran with Earthrights International the first sort of environmental law training session for about 50 NGOs. And again, for me, waking up every morning in Yangon, and this was during the transition period, before Dorsu, before Aung San Suu Kyi was elected or the NLD election 5 years ago, and always wondering, what was going to happen. But it was an exciting time at that time. The coup in February has changed it, but part of the reason why it's so devastating is because people were really believing that the future was going to be different. And that's also something that we have to be connected with, to realize that it's not all positive. Sometimes there are negatives that we just have to keep going, like COVID-19.
Yeah, actually about the future. So one of my colleagues was asking this question: how can we encourage people to understand the future effects of every small thing we are doing now with plastic reduction and consumption that have a major effect on our environment? I think this is from the Breaking Boundaries that I told you,
Yep. And
the
Breaking
movie in
Boundaries.
Netflix, Breaking
Yep.
Boundaries. Yeah. She's asking, what would planet Earth look like after 10 and to 20 years?
And so why, I think we can all do a lot of good. And one thing I wanted to mention is, when I read this amazing book when I was studying at university, by Charles Birch, who was an Australian biologist, and it's called Regaining Compassion for Humanity and Nature. And one of the key things about this book, which I think has always resonated with me, is we're all connected. So all our actions matter, from the small to the big. I think that's what we can do in all our ways. We can take specific action, whether you want that plastic bag or not. But at the same time, and this is where I'm really very strong, is that the real people that also have to work are the governments and the corporations. It was in 1992 when I was alive, and I can still remember, that the governments of the world came together. They passed the Framework Convention on Climate Change. They passed the Convention on Biological Diversity. They adopted the Rio Declaration on Environment, which talked about the polluter pays and public participation and engagement, and all of the things that we now look on as fundamental principles of environmental law. They put in place Agenda 21, which has now led to the Sustainable Development Goals. So 30 years ago, governments took action. Since then, we've had a lot of backsliding. And corporations, and I see corporations now, they're saying they're doing wonderful things. Well, they're not. An oil company for the last 100 years has been doing bad things, can't get better because of 1 year of good practice. We've got to make sure that we hold those corporations to account. And more, I think now we have to say, just having a nice report about your sustainability is not enough. You've got to go back in your history and look at that. We do that in America. They have to do that with their connections to slavery. In Australia, we have to see who took over Indigenous land and what they did. So now we also have to think about the truth behind the where we are in the environmental destruction, and we have to hold corporations to account. And I think the Carbon Majors inquiry by the Philippines Human Rights Commission is one of the most extraordinary things in the world, because they're trying to get behind the image and look at the facts, and hopefully we can then apply the law and hold these corporate polluters to account. I'm very strong of the opinion that what we do does matter, but certainly what a major company like Shell or BP or BHP, Rio Tinto, or Amazon now, or Microsoft, all of these companies, they can't just be carbon neutral. We have to look at their supply chains and make sure that they act strongly to have really consistent and honest environmental policies that take into account all of this history all of the issues, and that's a challenge. But that's something that we lawyers can really do. We can look
Yeah,
forward to a challenge.
actually, that was my one of my reflection when I'm studying Constitution of the Philippines. So here we have a lot of great laws, but it is not implemented properly. I was like, oh, this is great, but when you read the case, it's not implemented properly. I was like, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating on the part of the future generation. Because we have
And
good laws,
yeah,
we have great laws.
and yet I heard Justice Ascuna talk about having the constitutional right in the Philippines, the writ of amparo for the human rights violation, the Supreme Court rules of procedure, the writ of kalakasan. There are things in the Philippines that, looking outside, we see are really great, and we'd like to use them. But then, as you say, we have to also see, is it being implemented? It's great to have a law, but is it being implemented? And of course, I think that's where all of us as lawyers, whether we're corporate lawyers or tax lawyers or business lawyers or environmental lawyers, we now have to start putting environmental law throughout all of the law, and that's, I think, a big challenge over the next 10 years. And I said at a conference a couple of years ago, Law Asia had a human rights conference in Delhi, and this was before coronavirus, and I said, well, I know lawyers have a duty to the court, that's fundamental. We have a duty to the clients, that's also fundamental. We have a duty to the administration of justice, but maybe we have a fourth duty, and that's the duty to the planet, that we have to make sure that all of these other three duties ensure that we have a livable planet in the next 50 years. And the planetary boundaries argument certainly shows that we are very much on borrowed time. We just haven't done enough in the last 30 years. We can still do more. We can still change it. I think there's still time, but now we have to really act and act with passion.
Yeah, I think this pandemic becomes a silver lining with regard to the environment, because here in the Philippines, it's there is plantitos and plantitas. So most of the families are planting trees on their window, planting plants on their windows in their houses, and I hope it will continue after this pandemic.
Yeah.
So, with regard to all of those, in one or two words, how do you think we can reignite our viewers' passion for environmental protection?
So I would say, for me, it is about regaining compassion. Regaining compassion for humanity after the COVID crisis, and regaining compassion for nature. Because I think if you
Yeah,
are
actually,
compassionate,
can you
you act.
can you show the book of Charles so that our viewers might want to
Yeah.
read? We don't.
And you see all
I the
the
notes.
notes.
Yeah, yeah. I love the regaining compassion. So thank you so much, Matthew, for your inspiring stories about how you put up the aerial, your insights and messages to our viewers. So I just want to remind all of our viewers that let us all pass on the passion for the future generation. And what you said about the regain the compassion, you regain the compassion in protecting the environment. So let us remind you that from what our conversation had, we are all connected with nature. So stay tuned for more inspiring stories as told by environmental law champions, activists, and leaders from across the region and beyond. I am Natalia Manes, your host, signing off.